There's about 204 people registered for this webinar, and then we got a couple thousand that watched on the live streams the other day. So expect it'll be similar.
Cool.
All right. Hello, all. Welcome to Vote Common Goods webinar on the threat of Christian nationalism and a faithful response. My name is Doug Pagitt, and very glad to be one of your co-hosts tonight, sharing the co-hosting duties with Stephany Spaulding and with Christy Berghoef. We're really thrilled about your attendance with us tonight. We know it's going to be a really meaningful night because there's a lot of work that we need to do in this country. And I'm in Minneapolis. That's my home. It's where I'm coming from. I know a lot of you are thinking about and caring about the pain that's happening in Minneapolis with Daunte Wright's family and, of course, in the Derek Chauvin trial and George Floyd's family. And so we appreciate your thoughts and your concerns and prayer about the broken hearts that are so evident in the lives of people here in our city. And so thank you for holding us close tonight and for being a part of this with us. Stephany and Christy are people that are well suited for this conversation because they have been thinking highly about the role of Christian nationalism, how it impacts faith communities, and how it impacts individuals. So Stephany, Christy, really good to be sharing this with you tonight.
It's definitely a pleasure always to be with you, Doug, and with the phenomenal Christy Berghoef. It's been a second since we've been in a room together, but I'm glad to be still in conversation and still in relationship at such a time as this, because again, this is what I pray that more and more people are able to see and to engage in and to deal with and to build. So Good to be here tonight. Christy, how are you?
Doing well. We're hanging in there. I think like everyone else, trying to process everything that's happening in our country right now. It's hard to see the same things happening again and again and again. It's tough times, I think, in this country, despite the change in the administration. So I'm glad to be here with you all tonight. And I think that, Christian nationalism is something that we need to be discussing and talking about more, and considering our own role in it and how we can move away from it and move forward through it.
Yes, and we are joined tonight by Andrew Whitehead and by Samuel Perry. They are authors, they are professors, they are sociologists, they are people that have studied the issue of Christian nationalism. And we're so grateful, Andrew and Sam, for your willingness to be with us tonight. And they're going to give us some understanding and some teaching on what Christian nationalism, how it functions in our world. And I think you're going to find this as something very powerful and helpful, because the deep understanding that they've done by surveys and by scientific study of the opinions around Christian nationalism is something that I think will help a lot of us take that impression that we have in our spirits or in our hearts and to recognize that there's ways to understand that and there's some ways to respond to it. And Andrew and Sam, I'm just so appreciative for your book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. It's one of the great resources that people can use to help them understand what's going on. So thank you to the two of you for being with us tonight.
Yeah, really happy to be here. Thanks so much. And yeah, just looking forward to this and more conversations.
Yeah. Why don't you give us a little background on what you do? We'll talk more about the book here after we show a video, but tell us sort of where you come from, where you're sitting tonight, and what you do spending your days.
Well, yeah, I'll dive in first here. So I'm an associate professor of sociology in Indianapolis is where I'm at now, at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And just came from Clemson. That's where I did a majority of the writing and all the writing really for this book. But yeah, I grew up in northern Indiana in a real religious area, and like maybe many here tonight, just kind of the air you breathe and the world around you, just this understanding of, America is a Christian nation. This is taken for granted, right? We don't even really question it. And I think, growing up with that and then, over the last 15 years, 20 years or so, just really starting to think through some of the implications of that. And then really to this point, the great joy of my professional life is really studying this and trying to apply, the methods that we have and work with Sam and collaborate on this and try to do what we can to add to this conversation, because a lot of people are writing about it, but being able to, really look at data and the extensiveness of this, I think is something that we try to do and that we're continuing to try and do. So I think that's a little bit of, where I come from and what this means to me.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So like Andrew, evangelical background, grew up in Dallas and Ohio and Georgia. So all over a little bit, always a part of the church. Went to an evangelical seminary in Texas before I became a sociologist as a second career. And, I think like Andrew, we wanted to bring data to bear on a lot of these questions that we started to recognize a little bit before Trump, in fact, and we didn't realize how Trump would dial it up to 11, the things that we were studying and cause us to question even more. And so I feel like our specific contribution to this conversation, that, like Andrew said, there are a lot of people who are now writing about Christian nationalism, and we're so thankful for that. We feel like our contribution to this really is to try to hang some empirical hooks on this and try to measure this phenomenon, to try to understand how it corresponds, where we see it prevalent in the United States and how it corresponds to the various other attitudes and behaviors that we find so threatening in the U.S.
Well, it's going to be a really helpful piece for people tonight to put that empirical study and the analysis that you do, we're going to get a piece of tonight. And hope they also will pick up your book, Taking America Back for God. But for a lot of us, we got into this in the last few months with a whole new level of urgency, because there was an insurrection on January 6th at our United States Capitol that I believe, and so do many people who've studied it, was fueled by, and the driving idea for the insurrection came from notions of Christian nationalism, and specifically white Christian nationalism. We're going to play a video that's about 1 minute and 10 seconds long that was shot inside the Senate dais on the day that the insurrection happened. And we showed this last week in session 1 of this webinar. And I think we'll show it for a few of these, because we have people, first of all, that were not around last week and didn't have a chance to see this. And I think it's important to set the context. But also, I have found, as someone who's watched this video many times, that there is a renewed sense of the urgency when you see these people, these insurrectionists, storm the Capitol, come in, take over the Senate, and then shout the name of Jesus, pray a prayer, and frame their actions inside the Senate as being an act of Christian nationalism, for which they are proud. So I think this is a helpful way to start this empirical conversation about the data with the impassioned response that people of faith and people of good conscience need to have when we see people of our own tradition treating it this way. So here's that video. This was shot on January 6th.
All the way back to the monument of D.C.
Jesus Christ, we invoke your name. Amen. Let's all say a prayer in our sacred space. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for gracing us with this opportunity. Thank you. Let me take it back. Thank you, Heavenly Father. Amen. For this opportunity to stand up for our God-given unalienable rights. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us into the building, to allow us to exercise our rights, to allow us to send a message to all the tyrants, the communists, and the globalists that this is our nation, not theirs. That we will not allow the American way of the United States of America to go down. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for filling this chamber with your white light of love, with your white light of harmony. Thank you for filling this chamber with patriots that love you and that love Christ. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent Creator God, for blessing each and every one of us here and now. Thank you, divine Creator God, for surrounding and filling us with your divine, omnipresent white light of love and protection, peace and harmony. Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name we pray.
That is a disturbing thing to witness. I'm sure we all feel that way. Stephany, Christy, any response to that? And we'll also ask Andrew and Sam to do the same.
Every time I watch it, something inside of me just breaks and calls me to ask for mercy, because it's, it's the Jesus save us from your followers, right? Like the guy in the beginning is just like, we invoke your name, and I can only imagine Christ from my place of faith, in heaven saying, like, please don't invoke my name. Like, let's not speak about who I am, because I am so disassociated from what you all are doing, and the idea that you would attempt to associate the image and the beingness of Christ with this is it's just angering, it's incendiary, and it's heartbreaking. So every time I watch it, it's something different that comes up for me.
Yeah, I think for me, it just, I would echo a lot of what Stephany said, but it just hits you in the gut with kind of this sickening smack. It just feels so wrong on every level. And I physically feel uncomfortable when I watch it. And also just this incredible sense of entitlement that these people have, that we go in, we break in the Capitol, we kill people, we erect these lynching stations, and we do all of this in the name of Jesus. And we're coming to take back what's ours. It's just all so gross. I feel gross watching it.
Yeah, likewise. I don't know, Andrew, Sam, have you seen this video before? Is it something familiar to you? Do you have any reactions or thoughts to it from all the study that you've done?
Yeah, I watched that video, a number of times when it happened. That New Yorker piece came out, and too, like a lot of Americans watching on the day, right, turning on the news and just seeing those events unfold as the the crowd moves towards the Capitol and then is on the Capitol steps and then goes in, and just sitting there dumbfounded. And one thing that always comes back to this for me is, while it was shocking to witness and to even hear that prayer, it wasn't necessarily surprising, because of what we've seen over the past, before Trump. Trump isn't something that came out of nowhere, right? There were things that were really leading up to this, and I think next week maybe you have Kristen Dumais on. I think I saw, so a plug for that. Where as we look at even the past 40, 50 years, we see a process here where. When we survey Americans and those that strongly embrace Christian nationalism, it's this idea of this country is made for us, and the us is white, conservative Christian, conservative politically, natural-born citizens, those that they view, this is our country. And so when they say we're taking it back, they really mean for them. And I'll turn it over to Sam here, but, when we wrote in our book at the very end, this was obviously pre-insurrection, but, those that strongly embrace Christian nationalism, if democracy stands in the way of their vision for the country, then they're happy to see democracy be pushed aside. And that's really what we saw in the insurrection was, a snatch at power. Right? We are going to maintain our privilege and power for our group. And so those are some of the things that, bubble up as I watch that video again. But Sam, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think I can't help but listen to some of the code words that were said in that prayer, that they thanking God for sending a message that this is our nation, not theirs. And so who does he mean by ours and who does he mean by theirs? Like it's so clear once he starts to describe the them, right? Like it's not the powers and the principalities. It's not Satan. It's not spiritual forces. It's the communists and the tyrants and the globalists. It's the people that they feel like are trying to wrest power from the good, decent people, us. Christians that we, and I mean that in a dog whistle sense, not in an actual sense, but I just mean that in the way that this is how they're defining this category of patriots, Christian patriots who love God and love Jesus. That's what he said. But I think it also hits on all of the, like Andrew was saying, even though this was obviously, we wrote the book before the Capitol insurrection, it has all of the elements of the things that we were describing in our book, the justification for authoritarian violence, when you feel like your group of people is being threatened, the unquestioned allegiance to the narratives that Trump was putting out, and the misinformation that he put forth, things that we have in subsequent surveys found even stronger now than before, when we've been able to focus on certain subpopulations. And so even though we didn't write about it in the book, I mean, I think all of the things that we wrote about prefigure and really told us that such a thing was possible. And I think, as others have said, it just sickens you to your stomach to see it unfold.
And not at all to make light of it, but you must have thought, when this happened and has become known to the rest of the public, that, wow, this really confirms what we've been trying to say. Like, I imagine for the two of you, it was filled with sort of grief that the insurrection and the death of the officers and all the pain that there was. But was there a sense that you feel that there's something beneficial that can come from the rest of the country being awakened to what you noticed in the surveying that you did and the study that you did that ultimately came out in your book?
Yeah, I do. I think that the more that people are willing to talk about it, and especially within white evangelical spaces, congregations, denominations, because it really is centered within that tradition. And so the more that they wrestle with that, and I think, Sam could confirm this too, that the interest in our work or things that we heard from others after the insurrection, I think that was a moment where, those that may have kind of ignored it or said, oh, this can't be that big of an issue, started to really see that, okay, this is something that has a lot of weight behind it. It is a force within our body politic. And we need to talk about it. The Gospel Coalition, which, that's a different type of group within white evangelicalism, but they're meeting here in Indy, and I wasn't there, but, they had a little breakout session about Christian nationalism. And I don't know what was said there, but they were at least talking about it. Whether they bought into, for us, kind of our empirical, data that show that this is a widespread issue or not, but they're at least talking about it. And that, that's a wing of, white evangelicalism that if they're wrestling with it, I think that's good. And I know that those in more progressive spaces, Protestant spaces, are too. And so the more that happens, I think is key, because it's not going away. It's been around a while, and it's definitely not going anywhere. And so the more that we can do that, the better. But like you said, it does sicken you that it's this applicable. Watching that day, shocked, but again, not surprised.
All right. Well, we've talked a bit about. Go, Stephany. Yeah, please.
Well, I'm curious, and I might even be jumping ahead, and I apologize if that is the case. But you bring up this moment of awakening and how prophetic in some ways your text is, your work is. But you also talk about both of your backgrounds being in evangelical kind of conservative space, and shout out to Purdue, Indiana. I'm a Purdue grad, so I know the Lafayette scene. Yes. So yeah, I'm curious, like, you all get to this point ahead of the masses, right? Like, you get to this place before an insurrection happens. What was the wake up moment for you coming out of this evangelical culture that allowed you to even want to ask the questions?
I'll take this one first. I'm quite thankful for my background. I was raised by evangelical parents who I'd say were not Christian nationalists. And this is actually one of the things that gives me hope that evangelicalism doesn't have to be about this, or at least at the very least, like faithful Bible-believing Christianity that loves Jesus doesn't have to be characterized by white Christian nationalism. Because my parents, I was raised in a multiracial home where my parents often would denounce attempts of religious leaders to equate Republican Party affiliation with authentic Christianity. And they called that to account. And when we started studying it a few years ago, my parents welcomed that and celebrated it. And so I think for me, it actually is something I'm so grateful for, because I've never been in those contexts where, I mean, I've been because of doing research, but I was not raised in a context where those two things were so closely wedded together. And I tell people it's when you've been able to sit at the feast that you know you're being served excrement, right? Like you know that what you're being served is a lie and it's false. And so I think that has given me a conviction that this is this hot garbage that we see as Christian nationalism is built on a foundation of lies and idolatry, and we'd love to oppose it.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about the context. Tell us what's in your book, right? You've done all this work. Give us the Cliff's Note version of what you found in the study. How prevalent is this? Who believes it? What did you learn when you did this? And is it really a threat, or are people like us and others who are worried about this? Are we all do about nothing here? And this will just is a little virus that'll be in our system, but the body politic and the church will ultimately be fine. What did you find out?
Yeah, well, I'll dive in first and then let Sam finish it off. So in our book, we performed were able to get data on these large national surveys, and we asked respondents 6 different questions where they could strongly disagree to strongly agree with them. Things like, the United States is part of God's plan, or the federal government should advocate Christian values, or declare the U.S. a Christian nation. And so the degree to which people strongly agreed with those or strongly disagreed, we assigned them point values, and we're able to create a scale by adding all those different questions together. And we did that because it's really important to understand that Christian nationalism isn't a binary, yes or no, but that Americans really are all along a spectrum, where some embrace it really strongly. Some, see, Christianity being a part of what we do in the U.S. is important, and others kind of resist that. Or the rejectors, who we see on the very end of the scale, say, there should be no fusion of this type of Christianity, which we define in our book is really this idea of a white, conservative, natural-born citizen. That's the Christian that they're talking about. American civil society shouldn't be fused to this type of Christianity. And so when we're able to create that scale, we can now look at, well, how do these respondents view the world? And there were 3 basic things that we tried to do throughout the book, and were our main takeaways. Is the first, that Christian nationalism matters. And so Sam, he'll be able to share, even with his more recent data, that when we're looking at anti-democratic attitudes, or we're looking at policing of African Americans, if we're looking at immigration, if we're looking at refugees, if we're looking at religious minorities, we're looking at all these different important hot button issues, Christian nationalism consistently matters over and above whether you're Republican or Democrat, whether you are an evangelical or a mainline Protestant or unaffiliated, whether you attend church a lot or you believe the Bible should be read literally. When we account for all those things, Christian nationalism is still consistently one of the most important predictors. So what that tells us is that this is a key lens through which Americans view their social worlds. Whether they embrace it or reject it, it is doing work in how people are interacting with their world. The second thing we find is that Christian nationalism is not only really important, but it's an actual thing. And I just use kind of this, non-sociological language here, because it isn't just racism. It isn't just conservative politics. It isn't just authoritarianism, but that it is something different. It's its own thing. And so we're studying that. And then our final kind of main finding is that Christian nationalism does not necessarily equal being religious or being evangelical or being a faithful Christian. because we find that those that reject Christian nationalism but maybe attend an evangelical Protestant church, they look completely different from fellow evangelicals who might embrace Christian nationalism really strongly. And so this is something that cuts across religious traditions. So if you're a white Catholic or a white mainline Protestant who embraces Christian nationalism, the likelihood that you really support the insurrectionists is equally high to white evangelicals, what we're finding. And so this is something that really operates across religious traditions. And so those are some of the key kind of points we make in the book. But Sam's been collecting some amazing data lately. And so, yeah, Sam, I'll let you share just a little bit of that.
Yeah, I mean, just to finish off the discussion of the book, though, I think the way the book progresses is we describe how really Christian nationalism worships at the holy trinity of power, boundaries, and order. It values three things primarily: power and making sure that our group stays in power and is able to maintain that power. We demonstrate that in the book through its Christian nationalist support of Donald Trump and his policies and his brand of politics. And we've been able to demonstrate that in subsequent studies as well. That Christian nationalism, and especially white Christian nationalism, is very concerned with maintaining proper boundaries between us and them. That's really one of the things that Christian nationalism boils down to, is marking off who is the us that has the rightful power in the United States and who is the them that we oppose and want to make sure that we marginalize or oppress or drive out. And then the last one is order. Christian nationalism at its core longs to establish and reinforce a very particular traditionalist social order in which everybody recognizes their proper place in the family, in society, in the church. And so it manifests in a variety of ways, but really that's kind of the breakdown of the book, is how Christian nationalism reinforces and worships at that holy trinity of power, boundaries, and order.
Now, someone has asked in the chat, Stephen Petty asked, is there a litmus test for Christian nationalists? And then he names policy positions like abortion or marriage laws. Something. It sounds, Sam, like you're saying there is a litmus test, but it's actually this power, boundaries, and order, that it's not just policies, it's an approach. Is that fair to say, if someone's going to talk about this with others, that they not use policy positions necessarily, but use these other categories?
Yeah, I think that's a great recommendation. I don't necessarily think particular policies have to be completely characterized by Christian nationalist ideology or impulses, but I would say you can use people's general orientation as an indicator that the Christianity that they say they subscribe to is more of a Christian nationalist variety. So, for example, one of the things I just mentioned, this us versus them orientation. If a Christian is expressing opinions in a way that it's clear that their relationship to unbelievers in the world, people who are not Christians, is not us for them, us serving them, us sacrificing for them and loving them and dying for them if necessary, but it's us against them trying to take what is ours. I think that's a telltale sign that you have fused power and culture and Christianity together, and you feel like something is being corrupted or robbed that matters to Jesus in that there's some kind of American culture that Jesus cares about, rather than the lives of these people and their very souls. And so I think an us versus them orientation is a great indicator. I think and related to that, I think the sense of talking about Christianity as a culture rather than as a person. If I don't want to win the world for a culture. I want to introduce people to a person, right? Like that is Christianity. And so that is the relationship that we're talking about. So I think those two things are give an indication or of that person's orientation. Is that authentic Christian faith that we would recognize as biblical, or is it the kind of thing that we think would be characteristic of somebody who's a culture warrior for Christian nationalism? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off that really quickly, when we measure Christian nationalism, we're careful to not use policy positions, a bunch of policy positions to make, to measure whether somebody is embracing it or not, because then we're just kind of predicting the outcome already. But our questions are just asking them, whether they think the U.S. should be a Christian nation. And I guess, saying the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation could be a policy position. But we're really just asking about how privileged should Christianity be in wider culture, in public society. So I think, to the question, the person who asked a great question, getting a sense from people of, hey, do you think Christianity should be privileged, right? Is this a nation for Christians? And that, if we get the right people in power, will it be better? I think that's a great way to tease out how much they might embrace Christian nationalism. And from our work, we'd see that a whole host of policy positions flow from that. But ultimately, it's about that desire to see Christianity privileged in the public sphere.
Can y'all talk about the who you all surveyed? Because again, I could sit here and I'm sure that there are audience members who will sit here who are Christian, whether Protestant, mainline, evangelical, Catholic, and they'll be like, I wasn't surveyed. And maybe, like they're skewing the conversation, right? So can you talk about the who?
Yeah, so we have for both for the book and subsequently afterwards, all of our survey data are based on national random samples of Americans, and we consider them representative of the population. And so the reason we do that is because we don't want to just have like a single group of people in a church or all of our friends or what would be a biased sample. We want a representative sample so that when we look at the data and we see these patterns in there, we can generalize to the broader population and say, this is how Christian nationalism works when it comes to political attitudes and values and behaviors.
Well, one of the things that you do in your book is you suggest these categories. I guess, Andrew, you mentioned it earlier that there's sort of a spectrum. Can you say a bit more about this? Because I think a lot about the pastors who are watching this and who are engaging in this because they're giving ministry leadership. And I've been a pastor for a long time, and I didn't want to talk about Christian nationalism. I'm like, look, that's fringy stuff. I don't want to pick a fight with those people. I don't want anything to do it. I just want to avoid it. Having looked at your material, I'm like, I think I might have been doing a real disservice by wanting to avoid this. Can you talk a bit about the categories that you have of people that are really into it, people that are against it, and then the accommodators? But I mean, I'll let you put your own words around it.
Yeah, definitely. So, thinking too back to that scale that we created, those that are on the very low end, so who strongly disagree with a lot of these questions, we call them rejectors. And so they're the ones that say, we don't really want any sort of close, relationship between this type of Christianity and American civic life. And so then we have resistors. And these are Americans that are a little more undecided. So they don't wholly oppose Christian nationalism or Christianity being a part of the conversation, but they're definitely uncomfortable with it. And then the group, kind of, if you know where the mean is of the scale, right in the middle, the group on the other side of that mean, from resistors, we call accommodators. And this is the largest group. This is about 30%, a little over 30% of the population in various surveys that we include these questions over and over. So they're the largest group, and they're the ones that, again, don't completely embrace Christian nationalism. But when we talk to them and when we interview people for the book all across the U.S., our accommodators are those that think, well, Christianity has played a good role in the past. It should be a part of kind of what happens in American civil society. Maybe a little uncomfortable with it being the only religion, but they kind of are like, well, most of us are Christians. And so, yeah, the prayer at the Friday night football game should probably just be Christian. But again, they aren't quite as strongly embracing it. And then you have ambassadors, and they're the ones at the highest end of the scale. And they're the ones that really strongly embrace this idea of the U.S. is a Christian nation. Always was, always should be. We have to take it back in order for it to maintain a blessing from the Christian God. And ambassadors are just around 20% of the population. So if we put ambassadors and accommodators together, it's a little over 50% of Americans are at least open to or friendly towards this idea of Christianity being privileged in the public sphere. And so when we look at it in that sense, churches, people kind of self-select into different churches, but think most white evangelical or even white mainline churches are going to have a lot of people that are at least somewhat embracing Christian nationalism.
And I would say I think this has been one of those things that if we get pushback from the book on it is people are just shocked that this isn't a fringe thing as much as they would like to. So I'll just give you an example, and I don't mean to. I'm not bashing anybody on here, but after the Capitol insurrection, Al Mohler goes on his show and is talking about Christian nationalism and addresses some of the things that we had written. But ultimately he says, hey, this sounds like a really bad thing, but these people aren't real Christians, or this is just a marginal fringe kind of thing. And let's make sure that in all of this conversation, Christians aren't denied the opportunity to influence politics for the better. And we understand that. But when you actually look at the data and you see this item by item with where American white evangelicals in particular stand on these issues, well over half of white evangelicals believe that the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, right? Like well over half. That's not marginal. That is over half of them. In recent surveys, and this one blows people away. In recent surveys, we've been asking Americans, what do they think about whether the founding documents are divinely inspired, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And well over 2/3 of white evangelicals believe the founding documents are divinely inspired. That is not fringe. And so I think one of the things that we in the book, I mean, if there is a powerful takeaway of the book, it is how pervasive this ideology actually is. And you can compare this to things that white evangelicals are really complaining about and fearful of right now. So there's all of this fear and conversation about wokeness or critical race theory. They're having entire conferences to denounce this thing that they feel like is so pernicious and so scary and so pervasive that they use this word. And yet, where's a measurement for such a thing? If you tried to, I bet it would be less than 5% of the white evangelical population would be characterized by anything that would be characterized by critical race theory. And yet Christian nationalism talks about the majority of that crowd. And so if we ought to focus our attention, our argument has been if we want to focus our attention on an ideology that we feel like is pernicious and harmful and pervasive, it ought to be white Christian nationalism first and foremost.
Yeah, and I think just real quick, when we talk about pernicious and harmful, not only to the American Christian church, the global Christian church, but American democracy as well. It has repercussions for our civil society, whether you're a Christian or not. And we, have friends and people that are working in this area who are atheists or agnostic, and they recognize too and see it for the threat that it is. And so hopefully those that are religious will see that this harms the global church. It harms the church's witness. And, there are writers and, Jonathan will be able to lay that out really well. But there's threats not just to Christianity, but also to democracy.
It is disturbing. So yeah, please, Christy.
No, I was just it's kind of an observation and a comment and a question, but somewhere in your book, and I was just trying to find it and I can't remember where it was, but you talk about kind of where is this headed, and that there seems to be kind of an ebb and flow, throughout history. And I'm curious because I live in Holland, Michigan, just north of you in Minneapolis, and it's a conservative place. And, generally Christianity is very tied to a certain kind of conservative politics and to Christian nationalism. We're seeing it a lot right now. And in the past, if your person loses the election, it's like, okay, well, we lost. Well, next time. I have never in my life seen anything like what I'm seeing now. The outrage of pastors, outrage of people in the community who are they're like, the devil is taking over our country, and Trump flags are still going up. Trump yard signs are being replenished and replaced. These are conservative Christian people. I can't wrap my head around it. And this book is so helpful in giving categories to think about it. I think the categories are really, really helpful. But when I hear you talk about the ebb and flow, I think, where is this going? Because I've never seen anything like this. I mean, there's always maybe that ebb and flow, but this feels just off the charts. I've never seen anything like it.
Right. I mean, compare it to as late as 2012 November 2012 election. Mitt Romney loses, and the Republican Party does like an autopsy, and they say, "What did we do wrong? What can we learn from this?" And they weren't happy about it, but none of them were crying illegitimate election and stolen election. They actually turned inward for a moment, and then they decided to double down with a character like Trump to try to win the next election. But there obviously wasn't what we see now. I feel like one of the obstacles that we are now combating and dealing with is misinformation and the siloing of information. And so you've got all of these sources that now cater exclusively to this white Christian nationalist crowd. You've got what is becoming Fox News, Breitbart, OAN, Newsmax, and I'll tell you one that is so powerful in my neck of the woods is American Family Radio. It's the only Christian talk radio in this area. And I listen to it every day as long as I can stand it. And they are, with every show, preaching stolen election, that COVID vaccine is a hoax, that you shouldn't take it. I mean, this is a common narrative. Today, in fact, I was on the way home and listening to American Family Radio. And they were giving, this is a fundraiser, a pledge drive that they're giving, and they were giving personal testimonies of people who had listened to the radio. And they weren't describing the testimony of somebody who came to Christ. They were describing the testimony of somebody who used to vote Democrat and now votes Republican. Like that was their personal testimony, how American Family Radio helped them to come alive and wake up to the reality. This is the kind of thing. And so the more people silo into these isolated information sources, and to trust these sources is to deny the trustworthiness of those sources. I think we have this ever increasing challenge of misinformation, of conspiracy theory, of feeling victimized by everybody else. And so it's an uphill battle for sure.
We have a few people that are asking some questions in the chat. So hold on to that thought, if you would, Steph, for a minute. And I think Mary Blessing.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to get to some of the questions.
All right, we're going to go to Mary. She's going to talk it in. Other people, if you're in the chat and you want to raise your question with your voice rather than the chat room, you're welcome to do so. So you can do that. And hey, Mary, are you live here with us now?
Am I?
We can't hear Mary. Yes.
Go ahead, Mary. I think you just were muted there for a second.
Shoot. This is weird. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you. There you go.
The notification on the screen made it look like I was supposed to choose unmute. Sorry. Thank you, host. So my question had to do with when you were doing your research and asking people if they thought Christianity should have a privileged position. Did you have a mechanism by which you could also ask their understanding of the actual Constitution? You know, I get the part, oh, it's divinely inspired. Well, okay, fine. Let's say it was. And it was inspired to say that this nation will not have a defined religious national connection. Did you get to ask that question if people even understood the First Amendment?
Not when writing the book, but actually in subsequent surveys, we have. So it's so Christian nationalism is strongly predictive of somebody misunderstanding the First Amendment. So we asked him a couple of true-false questions about whether the Constitution mentions our obligations to God several times. It does not, and yet Christian nationalists were more likely to say yes, it does. Or we asked a question about whether the First Amendment says that Congress can't restrict our religious liberty, but they can pass laws privileging Christianity. It does not, but Christian nationalists were the most likely to say, yes, it does. And so we do find that people who affirm that the Constitution is divinely inspired also happen to misunderstand a lot of American religious and political history. Yeah.
Steph, did you have any other questions there in the chat that you wanted to raise? that people?
Yes, there are a couple of other questions again, and people are really curious about like the who, like who are these individuals? They want to know what was the sample size, and to Mary's point, also the intelligence level. Did you all capture any of that information? The formal education of these individuals outside of what they might colloquially know of the Constitution?
Yeah, we did. So, the three main data sources, we did interviews, we did on-site, participation in Christian Nationalist services at different congregations. And then we had the quantitative data, and there were two primary sources of quantitative data. So one was the General Social Survey, which usually has, an N, which represents the number of respondents to the survey, can be, in the 2,500 to 3,500 range of Americans. And it is a nationally representative survey, and it really is the gold standard. Since the 70s, it's the gold standard of social science surveys. So we use that, and we also use the Baylor Religion Survey. And the different surveys that we use are around 1,600, 1,500 respondents, and it's a random survey of American adults. And so, for some people, they might see that and think, oh, that's barely anybody. But the beauty of statistics when I teach research methods in sociology is that a sample that size is actually extremely powerful in being able to make point estimates or at least examine relationships. Where, even with extrapolating to 300 million adults, if you want to be within a couple percentage points, you need a couple thousand respondents. And so we're able to lean on the power of random sampling and sampling theory to be able to extrapolate across these different places. And then regarding education, we account for education level in all of our models. So in the book, we just show bar graphs, to keep it relatively straightforward and easy to digest. But for the stat nerds who really get into that, we put all that in the back. And you can see in all of our different models, multivariate models, we're accounting for income, we're accounting for education. And so what that means is that we're able to compare, people with similar education, but maybe different on Christian nationalism. What's the effect then of them being different on Christian nationalism? Or if it's both low education, what's that effect of Christian nationalism? So we're able to account for those effects overall.
Awesome. I think that there's one more question. Mm-hmm. If we don't have time, that's cool.
No, we do. Yeah, for sure we do. Yep.
Awesome. The last question is, all right, so how do we quote unquote save these people, so to speak? Do you offer a methodology for changing the minds and souls of white nationalists? What is it? So if it's not education or poor religious instruction, like what's the method for trying to get these people to see the light? And I'm using all of the metaphorical language.
Oh, great. I'll just offer some thoughts. I mean, after what we've seen over the past year, I go back and forth between being really optimistic that we can turn some things around, and then other times being of the opinion that it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think some things that we can do to try to make it better before it gets worse is I think really challenge these sources of misinformation. I think one of the most toxic things out there are these lie factories, for lack of a better word, that just feed conspiracy theory and lie and falsehood to these populations that are kind of eating it up, and they're primed to believe conspiracy theories, to feel like victims. They just lost an election. That their leader, who they trust and put a lot of trust in, questioned the validity of that election. And so there's already a sensitivity to feeling taken advantage of and out of control and fearful about what the future holds. So I am thankful that Joe Biden doesn't seem to be the kind of guy who just wants to pick rhetorical fights and bully people on Twitter. I'm thankful that that Trump is no longer on Twitter, because I feel like freedom of speech, even though I think a lot of people think about freedom of speech being a priority, freedom of speech doesn't give somebody a the privilege to shout fire in a crowded movie theater. And Trump was shouting fire in a crowded movie theater 10 times a day on Twitter for fun. And he was a main conduit of misinformation. And so I think getting a hold of those sources of conspiracy theory and misinformation, shining a light on them and denouncing them. I do think conservative Christian leaders have a role to play in standing up for what is true and what is right, and saying, look, we have taken this and acknowledging, like, hey, maybe I shouldn't have bought into these lies. Maybe we should have reconsidered where we were going with this. But now let's make it right, and let's start doing the right thing. I really do. I'm not ready to write off those populations. I think the extreme ambassadors, like Andrew was describing, to some extent, that population may be a little bit too radicalized for us to reach right now. But those accommodators are worth talking to, right? Like we can speak to those accommodators and say, look, this is too much. This is wrong. This is idolatry. And let's bring it back to, I think, what we can all agree on, the values that we can uphold to defend democracy, to be a good Christian witness, to defend the integrity of the church. I think that's what I want to work for.
Well, Sam, Andrew, thank you so much for this. Again, the book is Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. And I have to say to people every time when I recommend this book, they're against Christian nationalism. I don't know if there's going to be a retitle, but I don't know, maybe put a slash through something there.
It's not a handbook.
It's not a handbook.
Not a how-to.
Yeah. So it's one of those. Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove is going to join us here in just a moment. But Andrew and Sam, thank you so much. You're very gracious. Your work is so important, and we're so glad to have it. We're going to talk a bit about you as you step away, and then we're going to bring Jonathan on here in just a moment. So to both of you, thank you so very much. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks to you all.
Yeah. Christy, Steph, I mean, I was just sitting here reading these great comments. Jeff Douglas says to all the panelists that the 2020 polling told us that Trump support was even higher than people thought, and maybe the polling wasn't accurate. And I kept thinking, what if it's even worse than we thought here? What if there's even more difficulty and pain? All right, we're getting a little feedback there. Sorry about that. What if there's even more difficulty and pain than we ever imagined? And just seems like we're really this webinar and all the other work that's being done is really important for this work, huh?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that there is not even that. I think the work since the election has reflected that we are still in deep water, right? If we're looking at the pushback to voter legislation, we are in so much deep water that it is far from being over. And the support is not fringed or marginalized. There were still tens of millions of people that wanted Trump to be president, and they are having conversations about him running again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really appreciated this last comment too about how, conservative pastors have a role to play. They have a really important role, I think, in helping to steer some of these changeable minds towards truth. And I know in my area, at least, pastors are really wrestling with this, and they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to do it because they're fearful that they're going to lose their job, and with that comes their pension and everything that goes with that. It's a big deal to think about speaking up in this way. So I think as many resources or as much help or advice as can be put out to them, they really are struggling, and they really have this ache in their heart. I know Christian school teachers, Christian educators in the colleges around here, same thing. And I'm sure all over the country are really, really struggling with how to cope with this, how to talk about it, how to address it.
Yeah, well, there's no one I know better to do that than our friend Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, who has joined us. Jonathan, thank you. Your work on figuring out how to be in the public spaces to have a witness and not delve into Christian nationalism has been just so crucial. We're so glad that you're here with us tonight to give us some reflection on this. And I will just mention that Jonathan did a webinar series, a multiple session webinar series. I think it was 4 or maybe 5. Jonathan, you can remind me.
5 sessions.
5 sessions this last month.
They're all on YouTube now at the School for Conversion, so folks can watch them there.
We will push them. We will send those links to all of you registered for this webinar because it is that good. It's just excellent. Jonathan, what's our way forward from a pastoral ministry sort of perspective? How do you think we should move?
Well, let me just say, first of all, you've just heard from the very best sociologists. I mean, I've got my book right here. This is the copy. To understand, I think, what's going on, what you've just heard is incredibly important. The only thing I would add to that in terms of where we need to go from here is that what they're describing empirically is the result of very intentional efforts that, let me add this, were and have always been and still are very well funded. So none of that is going to go away. And I think what Sam was saying there at the end about how, the ambassadors are going to continue to be ambassadors. Well, they're going to continue to do it because that's how they draw their paycheck. And for anyone who wants to understand better where all this is coming from, I would strongly encourage that you also learn about the research that Ann Nelson has done on the Council for National Policy, because there is one place where for the last 40 years, all of this has been coordinated. It's called the Council for National Policy. It was founded by Paul Weyrich. He's the guy who gave Jerry Falwell the name Moral Majority and convinced him that he needed to form a white voting bloc that would vote not its race, but its faith. And that's how we got the religious right. So that is what has brought us to this point, and I think created the culture of Christian nationalism that they've just described so well. What can we do about that? Well, I think what you were saying earlier is incredibly important to acknowledge, that while the religious right has pushed this nonstop for 40 years, the response to it has largely been from secular Americans, right? The only sort of organization that formed and sort of named itself as resisting the work of the religious right was People for the American Way. And, God bless Norman Lear. I liked his TV and I liked his organizing too. But what it created was a context in which the mainstream media and I think mainstream Americans understood the alternative to so-called biblical values and family values that the religious right was promoting as a kind of secular America. What we lost in that was the powerful moral witness of Christians and people of other faiths who want to build a multi-ethnic democracy. We had that front and center in the mid-20th century in the United States. As a matter of fact, the effectiveness of that moral movement that we usually call the civil rights movement is the very reason that the political organizers of the new right reached out and began to organize white religious folks, particularly in the South in the beginning, because they needed a way to keep a white voting bloc together without appearing to be racist in any explicit way, because the civil rights movement had won, right? They had won a public consensus that segregation was not the way forward, and that white supremacy, at least in an expressed and clearly articulated platform, was not what democracy was all about. So it's the absence of that very vocal and very present moral witness in public life that has led us to this place. I think what's critical in this moment is that we all need to invest in institutions that bear that public witness. And I think especially for white evangelicals, it's absolutely essential to realize we do not have much wisdom in this field. So we need to be learning from Black sisters and brothers. We need to be learning from brown sisters and brothers. We need to be tying in to organizations like the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute, the Repairers of the Breach, the Voices Project, Freedom Road, our sister Lisa Sharon Harper. I mean, some of these are older organizations, some of them are newer, but we have organizations led by people of color that are inviting Christians to bear witness in the public sphere. White evangelicals need to be following those organizations. That would be my most succinct advice.
I just want to be clear about what you said, Jonathan, in terms of two things. That one, and to Christy's earlier point about where pastors may or may not be wrestling right now, is we need to move our money if they will not uphold the morality of this moment, right? If we are facing this, pushback from the right that is really well funded, then those of us who are like at the grassroots level or going to these congregations every day, listening into the podcast and the sermon, we need to move our money and send messaging that, look, we need a morality that upholds what Christianity really is. And then that second piece, that we need to be coalition building with BIPOC-led community leaders.
Amen. Yes, indeed. And I mean, let me say this. I think what you're talking about on the first point, in terms of really challenging churches that we may be part of or may be connected to in some way, the challenge that I think is most important is the challenge to get involved, right? Too often what they were describing as ambassadors are those Americans who participate in Christian congregations who are not all that enthusiastic about the agenda of the religious right, but have basically decided that it's most comfortable for them if they don't challenge it too directly, and if they more or less talk about Jesus in a way that Jesus assures you some eternal salvation and some, peaceful life for you and your family in this world. That's kind of the Jesus that has been preached. And I'm not just saying on the sort of theologically conservative side of things. There's a lot of mainline white congregations that might be theologically liberal, but more or less still preach a Jesus that just lets you be more or less comfortable. And I think it's time to reclaim the Jesus who disturbs the peace. You can't read the Gospels too honestly without recognizing that while many of the poor and marginalized people whom Jesus embraced and affirmed were very enthusiastic about his presence, but almost anybody who had any power in that society looked at the brother sideways and in the end tried to kill him. That's the response people had to Jesus, because Jesus said, the kingdom of God is at hand. The kingdom of God, while not a partisan organization, is certainly a political entity. And I would contend that it challenges any party within any political system of this world.
Jonathan, I find your comments to be very prophetic and refreshing in this sense. Almost every conversation that I've had with people about Christian nationalism and the pains that go with it, people ask basically, how do I change the individual person's mind? I know a person who thinks this way. What can I say to them? How could I deprogram them? How could I de-radicalize them? I hear you suggesting that the way we do this for an individual is to move in community or to move in a collective action of some kind, not just to go with one conversation one-on-one, but to try to remake the conditions in which these individual people are holding these beliefs. Is that, am I getting at what your advice is?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Because you can't assume that the people who believe this are crazy in their context. But again, back to the empirical data that they were just laying out, there's far too many people to think that this is just, some sort of aberration that needs to be treated in individuals. No, this is a culture that is feeding people lies, reinforcing those lies, and inviting people to understand themselves as part of what I think people of faith, Christians, can only call an idolatrous worship of the nation as the kind of ultimate end. And the alternative to that has to be building a better community to invite people into. And I think while we need to be building culture in all kinds of ways everywhere, any strategic effort to address this has to especially focus on building community in rural places, and in particular in places that have been media deserts, because that is where, to get into the weeds a little bit, the Council for National Policy that I mentioned has had the executive leadership of all of those media companies that Sam mentioned, from American Family Radio to Breitbart News to Fox. They've all been on that council. They've all coordinated with each other for decades. And what they have done is they have strategically gone into places where there are not local newspapers anymore, where there's not local radio, and they have blanketed it with their message. So it's entirely possible, if your pastor participates in the Family Research Council's pastor program and takes their free literature, and if you are a member of the Republican Party and the NRA, which, by the way, have also coordinated very closely with this group, and if you listen to American Family Radio when you're driving the tractor out in the field, it's entirely possible that you never hear any other narrative in your life, right? There is no alternative in the place where you are. And so you would be crazy in that context not to believe this stuff. So I think anybody who knows that this is a lie has a moral obligation to try to enter these spaces and interrupt the wraparound culture that has been created by this propaganda campaign.
It is becoming clear to me that I have spent my adult pastoring life, nearly 30 years, in the self-proclaimed narrative as a rejector, to use the words from the book that Sam and Andrew wrote. That's what the narrative I've told myself. But I have functioned in my pastoral duties like an accommodator. Now, I didn't know I was, because I wanted to not talk about it. I thought it was fringy. I didn't want to bring it up. Not because I just didn't want to debate with someone about, do you think America is a Christian nation or not? I was so convinced of my rejector status that I didn't even think it was worthy to engage. And now I think, boy, we just left a lot of people who may have grown up with a different narrative, never even questioning it. And it feels a lot like the realization I had a number of years ago when Jackie Lewis said to me, well, you might be a non-racist church, but do you think you could pursue being an anti-racist church? Like taking proactively that you're going to try to drive it out? I'm having that very same moment now around Christian nationalism, where I would nearly break my elbow patting myself on the back for how deeply I held rejectionist attitude. But I think if you looked at my life at all and the stuff I said, wrote about, talked about, sermons I delivered, I gave 0 sentences to this topic. So somebody could have been around my life and the church that I was pastor of for 20 years and hardly ever heard me taking this on, so they wouldn't know. So I think about, man, maybe people like me and others really need to speak up specifically about these issues. So I don't know, Christy or Stephany.
Well, let me give you one very concrete thing for this year. You and any pastor in a similar context who's feeling such conviction, here's one thing you can do in 2021. Because I've been following closely the conversations among the Council for National Policy and their organizations, and they have all committed themselves to one thing in this year. They think it's their only hope of holding on to the power that Sam and Andrew were telling you is so important to them. They've decided that they're investing all of their energies this year to pass voter suppression laws in state houses. What if you as a pastor spent this year explaining to your congregation and having forums and conversations with your congregation about why voting rights is a biblical value, why it's a moral issue, why Christians, while Christians can have various political ideologies, various partisan affiliations, Christians around the world, participate in all sorts of different governments. But in the United States, if you believe that all people are created in the image of God, and you acknowledge that we live within a democracy that has guaranteed the right to vote to all citizens of a certain age in this country, then the systematic attempt to deny that right to some people so that you can hold on to power is a denial of the recognition that they are fully human, that they are as fully in the image of God as you are. And that becomes a moral issue. I think it's a sort of line in the sand that churches could call people to this year and say, look, if you're on any of the mailing lists, whether it's the Susan B. Anthony list or the NRA's list or the Family Research Council's list, you're going to be getting a steady stream of lies about, rampant voter fraud and the need to have election integrity because this is the only way we're going to preserve our democracy. And all of that has been hashed out in rooms where people are very clear that if the increasingly multi-ethnic demographic of this country turns out to vote in the numbers that voted in 2020, they cannot win the elections they want to win. They can't get Georgia back, and they're going to lose Texas. They're going to lose Florida, and this is their primary concern. So if that's the case, could we make voting rights a moral issue in 2021? That might be a place to put a little skin in the game for evangelical Christians.
Very good. Well, I'm not pastoring any longer, so I'm off the hook. I feel free as the breeze. So, it's on the rest of it.
But you're not, Doug. There are different ways. There are so many different ways to pastor, whether that's through a podcast or.
Hey, there's a great comment. There's a great comment that came in from a pastor in this area who has been speaking out and who was fired for it. I'm just gonna. Can I read it off the things that came in?
Please do. Yes.
Yeah, so he says one of the points that he tries to bring up when he's discussing Christian nationalism with people is that Christian nationalism seems to be fighting for their rights, but Jesus laid down his rights. He didn't fight for his right to life. He didn't fight for his right to liberty. He didn't fight for his right to happiness. He laid down all his rights out of love for others. I love that. I just think that's a great point and a great
like someone who's not only paid attention to the way of Jesus, but is also trying to follow it. Bless you, brother. I mean, I would say one of the things I'm eternally grateful for is that when I was in seminary, Wendell Berry came to campus and talked to us all. And I remember he said to us very earnestly, he said, I only have one piece of advice for people in seminary in the United States. He said, kind of like the Apostle Paul, you ought to have some kind of a tent making gig because you can't tell the truth very long in this country without getting put out of the church. Well, he's certainly, he's certainly commenting on the transformation of rural culture that he's witnessed in Kentucky in his life. Now, I don't think it's the case that all of our churches are all gone, but I certainly respect, the willingness of somebody to say, look, when Jesus's way departs from the church's way to the extent that the church no longer wants to be pastored in the way of Jesus, it may well be time to step away and ask, how else you could use your energies to serve the kingdom of God.
I am struck by the number of people who would give an amen to that and then give a Christian nationalist response. In other words, to say, and Jesus wants this country to be the beacon of Christianity around the world, right? So there's a root belief that the United States was formed and maintains a unique expression of the kingdom of God on earth. And that's what I have found so deeply inside of the Christian nationalist conversation, that when you challenge that, that's where the pushback really starts to get difficult. Because I think there's a lot of ways that Christian nationalists can take all of the let's do the right thing, let your morals drive you when you vote, but they're committed to this country staying a Christian nation that they believe it was founded as and needs to return to. Jonathan, any thoughts on that piece of the puzzle that's so rooted in so many people's thinking that they can't even get earlier than that argument in their minds?
Well, I would say the best remedy in practice is to be proximate to those people and even those Christian siblings in the family who have been marginalized by American society because they are not likely to believe in its exceptionalism. I think about someone like Frederick Douglass in the 19th century who said, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I see the widest possible difference. You people preach Jesus to me and they claim to own me. He said, come on, brother. I'm not going to believe that. And I think likewise, I'm constantly reminded that, while America has promised, some lofty ideals, the reality for so many poor people, for so many immigrants, for so many undocumented people, for so many native indigenous people to this land. I mean, the way in which this myth of exceptionalism caused people to just run over whole peoples and then, make promises on paper that they had no intention of keeping. I've been following closely and walking with my sisters and brothers out at Oak Flat in Arizona for the last few years. Y'all may have seen the story in the Washington Post this week. There was a hearing on Capitol Hill today. This is the holy site of the Apache people that John McCain threw a rider into a defense spending bill saying that a copper corporation could not only have the copper underneath it, but they could mine it in such a way that they would completely destroy the holiest site to these people. Now, try to do that to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. Try to do it to the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. You'd have, religious liberty people all over this country up in arms. But everybody who talks so much about religious liberty has had precious little to say about our dear sisters and brothers at Oak Flat. I think it's an example of how this myth of exceptionalism is so easily dispelled by paying attention to how, folks who've been marginalized in this story have experienced America and its commitment to democracy and liberty.
Can I push that a little bit further and also bring in one of the comments from one of our listeners that yes, for most, the majority of those who have really sat with the marginalization of life in the United States, there's still some level of what is the language? Not necessarily enablers, but accommodationist, right? To the Christian nationalist narrative that allows it to be as insidious as it is in the US. And so one of the questions that our listeners ask, explain where conservative majority Black evangelicals fall into these conversations, right? Even when we look at the last election cycle, we tend to separate out a breakdown of African-American or Black women voters versus Black men. And there was a large percent of Black men that rode along with Donald Trump and even like the spirit of what is happening. So how do we fit this into the conversation as well?
Oh, it's incredibly important. I mean, it's important to, if you know the history of the organizing that's been done to target communities, it's important to know that especially for the last 15 to 20 years, they have explicitly reached out to African-American evangelicals and to Latino evangelicals and to conservative Jewish folks because they realized, in the words of Ralph Reed, one of their strategists and organizers over many years, they realized that they needed to form a rainbow coalition, they said, borrowing from Brother Jesse Jackson. They wanted, I mean, while this is certainly in terms of history about a white voting bloc, particularly given the demographic shifts in this country, they have recognized that they can't maintain their white cultural values without also getting some Black, brown sisters and brothers on board. So you have your, I mean, they're very shrewd about recruiting your Diamond and Silk, your Alveda Kings, your folks who are going to speak to the community that they come from in language, that people often resonate with, but have this same agenda. And that's not new either. That's always been the case. This goes way back. The slaveholder religion of the 19th century that we were talking about earlier, had its advocates who had, few little privileges in the big house and therefore were willing to go and preach this to everybody and to, and to tell on folk who were trying to bring liberation. I mean, Denmark Vesey's whole plan down in Charleston got brought down by somebody in the Bible study that went to master and said, "Oh, you don't know what they're planning over there." So this is long been the case, and I think that's just a reality that we have to deal with. But I think it's clear that the overwhelming majority of people who have experienced marginalization in this country are able to see through this. I mean, it might have been twice as many black men who voted for Donald Trump as black women, but it was still just 8 or 9%.
And it tells us that the work is not done, and it's not as simple as some of us might at first blush believe that it is. So Jonathan, thank you for all of your good work. Christy, Steph, thank you for co-hosting tonight. Next week, friends, we're going to be back. Amanda Tyler, who runs a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. They are the gold standard of this work. They do exceptional work. She's going to be our content provider. We're going to have others that'll be sharing like they did tonight. We're very desirous of your input as well. Feel free to email us as we go. If you're not already in all of our spaces and places, you can find all of it over at votecommongood.com. In fact, Stephany and I host a Wednesday morning Faith for the Common Good podcast along with 2 other co-hosts starting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Central Time. So it'll just be 13 hours, and we'll be back on a stream just like this, and we'd love to see you on any of the social streams or any of the other places. Thank you for being a part of this. Share it widely with your friends. When you're over at Vote Common Good, don't miss that donate button. If this is the kind of thing that you want to keep having in the world, we certainly do. Your donations make all that possible, and we'd love for you to do so. So, Christy, Steph, thanks so much. And to all of you, we will see you back here next week at the same time at 7 p.m. Central Time, and all the places in between. So, good night.
Awesome.
Thank you, Doug.
Good night.
Good night.